In the autumn of 1887, in the silver town of Coyle Bend, Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood in the alley behind a boarding house with everything she owned tied in a single gray blanket, and she counted the coins in her palm twice because she could not believe the sum a second time any more than the first. $6.40, a folding knife, a whetstone worn to a curve, and a memory of an old man's hands closing a clasp the right way, which was the only inheritance that would matter before the snow came down. Her name was Della Voss, and 3 days earlier she had been the cook and the keeper of accounts for the Holloway house on the hill, until Mr. Reuben Holloway decided that a woman who kept a ledger too well was a woman who saw too much. He had paid her off in silence and shown her the door, and the town had watched her walk down from the hill with her blanket and said nothing, because the town did what the hill told it to do. What the town did not know, and what she did not yet fully know herself, was that the answer to everything Holloway had buried lay rusting in a teamster's yard at the bottom of the street, waiting for the only person in Coyle Bend who knew how to open it. Stay with me to the end of this one. There is a moment, weeks, from that cold morning when a man who thought himself untouchable learns that the thing he threw away had a lock, and that the lock had been waiting for a particular hand. You will want to be there when it opens. The Strongbox sat in Asa Pruitt's freight yard among the broken axles and the rope and the rust, and it had sat there for 11 years. It was an iron chest the size of a feed trunk, banded in flat strap iron gone the color of dried blood, and its lid was sealed, not by a padlock anyone could shoot off, but by a sunk combination mechanism of a make that no smith in the territory could touch. Pruitt had taken it years ago against a debt. The original owner never came back to pay, and he had tried every key and every bar and finally given up and used it as a bench for coiling rope. He called it the dead box. He told men it was empty, because a box you cannot open is the same as an empty one, and a man does not like to admit he owns a thing he cannot use. Della had seen it her first week in Coyle Bend 2 years before, when she had walked the freight yard looking for work and found none. She had recognized the maker's pattern, the way a person recognizes a face in a crowd, the way the strap iron crossed and the keyhole sat false above the true mechanism, and her chest had gone tight because she had been taught by the only man who ever taught her anything to read exactly that kind of lock. She had said nothing then. A penniless cook does not buy iron chests, and the foreman who had turned her away had no patience for a woman lingering over a thing she could not afford. Yet she had remembered it, the way she remembered everything, filed and folded and kept, the cross of the strap iron and the false keyhole and the particular maker's mark stamped small near the lower band. A mark she had last seen on a safe in a Denver bank, where Eli Garrett had once stood beside her and named the make under his breath, like a man naming a horse he admired. She had walked out of the freight yard that day with nothing, and the memory of the box had gone with her up the hill to the Holloway kitchen, and there it had waited 2 years the way a seed waits in dry ground for the one rain that will wake it. The man who taught her was named Eli Garrett, and he had been a locksmith and a safe man in Denver before his hands began to shake, and he had taken in a half-starved girl off the street because she could hold a tension wrench steadier than any apprentice he had paid for. She had come to his shop the first time to steal. She was not ashamed to remember it now, and he had caught her hand on the till and looked, not at the hand, but at the fingers, the long, steady fingers of a girl who had been hungry her whole life and had never once let it shake her, and he had given her supper and a stool and a week's trial, and the week had become 6 years. He was dead now, 4 winters gone, carried off by the same shaking that had ended his trade, and he had left her nothing. A court would recognize only the knife and the whetstone and the knowledge that lived in her fingers. He used to say that every lock was an argument between the man who built it and the man who wanted in, and that the trick was not force, but patience, was listening to what the iron wanted to tell you. Work with the grain of the thing, he said, not against it. A lock is honest. It is the men around it who lie. She had not understood him fully while he lived. She understood him better with every wheel she freed. So on the morning she was cast out with $6.40, Delavos walked down the hill, past the assay office and the shuttered bank and the saloon already breathing its sour breath into the cold, and she went to Asa Pruitt's freight yard, and she stood before the dead box, and she made him an offer. Pruitt was a wide, slow man with a rope-burned neck and an honest streak that ran exactly as deep as his own convenience. He looked at the woman in the gray blanket and he laughed, not cruelly, but the way a man laughs at a thing that strikes him as foolish. The box was iron and worthless and could not be moved without 4 men and a sledge, he said, and she could not even open it, and what did a cook want with a chest she could neither carry nor crack? She told him she would give him $4 for it as it stood, and that he would never have to look at it again, and that whatever was inside, if anything was inside, was his loss already, and would be hers if she could win it. Pruitt thought about the $4. He thought about the bench he would lose. Then he thought that $4 was $4, and a dead box was a dead box. And he spat in his palm and shook her hand and told her she now owned the most expensive seat in Coil Bend. A few men in the yard laughed with him. One of them said she had bought herself a coffin she could not fit in. Another said she ought to plant flowers in it. Della folded the receipt Pruitt scrawled on the back of a freight bill and put it in the leather satchel at her hip, and she did not laugh and she did not argue, and she ran her bare hand once across the cold banded lid the way a person lays a hand on the flank of a horse they mean to keep. The iron was cold as a creek in March. Underneath the cold there was something. She could not have told a soul what it was. Yet Eli had taught her that the first thing a lock tells you is whether anyone is home, that a sealed box full of air sits differently under the hand than a box that has weight settled low in its belly, and the dead box under her palm did not feel empty. It felt patient. It felt, she would think later, the way a held breath feels just before it is let go. What the laughing men did not know was that the chest had a name once, and that the name was burned into the underside of the lid where no one had thought to look, and that the name would set the whole hill to shaking before the first snow melted. She could not work it in the yard. A woman crouched over an iron box in the open is a spectacle, and a spectacle draws exactly the wrong eyes. So she paid Pruitt another 50 cents to cart it on his flatbed to the lean-to behind the old Dietrich smithy at the edge of town, a roofless, half-burned forge that no one had used since the smith died of fever and left no kin. The walls were 3 sides of stone and 1 of charred timber, and the roof was half there, and it was private, and it had a workbench bolted to the floor, and an anvil too heavy to steal. It would do. Winter was 4 weeks off by the smell of the air, and she had a little over $5 to her name, and she had bought a chest instead of bread. She spent the first $1 on a side of bacon, a sack of cornmeal, a tin of lamp oil, and a wool coat with a torn pocket from the second-hand man, and she spent the first night listening to the wind come through the burned timber and thinking about Eli's hands. He had a way of warming a cold lock with his palms before he ever touched a pick to it, because cold iron sits tighter, he said, and a lock you warm is a lock you befriend. She had no coal yet and no money for it. She would warm the dead box with her hands and her breath and her patience, and she would listen. On the second day, she began. She cleaned the face of the mechanism with lamp oil and a rag, and the point of the folding knife, working the rust out of the false keyhole and the seams until she could see the true shape of the thing. It was a 4-wheel combination lock of the kind Eli had called a banker's friend, sunk behind a steel plate, and it was rusted, but it was not broken. And the difference between those 2 words was the difference between her whole life now and the cold she had been thrown out into. A broken lock is a wall. A rusted lock is only a wall that has forgotten it is a door. The town learned within a day that the cook had bought the dead box, and the town found it funny. Word went up the hill the way water finds a low place, and Reuben Holloway heard it at his own supper table and laughed into his napkin and said that the Voss woman had finally found work she was suited for, sitting in a burned forge talking to a box that would never answer. He thought no more of it. He had a great deal else to think of. The territorial assessors were due in the spring, and Holloway had 11 years of careful arithmetic to keep careful, and a cook in a forge was a small thing, a thing already forgotten, and that forgetting was the first mistake he had made in a very long time. I will tell you now, because you have come this far, that the box and the man on the hill were already bound together by something neither Della nor the town could yet see. Keep that in your mind as the iron yields. It will matter more than the silver does. Eli's first rule had been patience, and his second had been the body. A locksmith works with her whole self, he taught her, not just her fingers, and a tired hand lies to you about what it feels. So Della made herself a routine the way a soldier makes a camp. She rose before light and worked the lock in the gray hour when her hands were freshest. She ate at midday. In the afternoon she split scrap wood for the little fire she allowed herself, and she walked into town to buy what small things she could, and to listen, because Eli had also taught her that half of any safe is what the men around it tell you without meaning to. By the third day her fingers were raw and the false keyhole was clean, and she had begun to understand the particular rust that had married the wheels of the lock together, and she understood that brute work would only weld them tighter. She needed to free them one grain at a time. She made a tension tool from a flat strip of the Strongbox's own scaled iron, ground to a temper on Eli's whetstone, and she made a pick from a length of clock spring she bought off the second-hand man for a nickel, and she heated penetrating oil in a spoon over her fire and worked it into the wheel pack a drop at a time, and she waited between drops the way you wait for rain. The first wheel did not move on the third day, nor the fourth. On the fifth day, in the cold gray hour, with her breath fogging the steel and her hands warmed against her own neck, the first wheel turned a single notch under her tension tool, and the small dry click of it was the first honest word the dead box had spoken in 11 years. And Della Voss closed her eyes and did not weep, because Eli had no use for weeping, but she sat very still and let the click be enough. That click was the loneliest sound and the sweetest she had heard in a long time, and there was no one to tell. She told the box, "Could," she said to it, the way Eli used to. Now the next word of her persistence reached the hill again, and this time it did not make Holloway laugh. A foolish woman gives up. A patient woman is a different kind of animal, and Holloway had not built what he built by ignoring the patient ones. He sent his foreman, a lean, quiet man named Tobias Crane, down to the burned forge under the excuse of buying scrap iron, and Crane stood in the doorway and looked at the chest and looked at the woman, and asked, in a voice flat as a ledger line, what she expected to find in a box that Asa Pruitt swore was empty. Della did not look up from the wheel pack. She said that empty was a thing you could only be sure of after you opened it, and that until then it was just a word men used to feel better about a locked door. Crane looked at her a while longer. Then he bought a broken hinge he did not need and went back up the hill, and what he told Holloway no one heard. But the next morning a notice was nailed to the door of the burned forge declaring the Dietrich property condemned and ordered cleared within 10 days by authority of the town assessor, who happened to bank with and owe his chair to. The man on the hill, 10 days. She had freed. One wheel of 4 more. The arithmetic of it sat in her chest like a stone, and for the length of one breath she felt the cold of the alley behind the boarding house. Again the $6.40, the laughing men. Then she set the stone down, because a stone you carry is a stone that drowns you, and she did what Eli had taught her to do with fear, which was to turn it into a schedule. 10 days. 4 wheels, she would not sleep more than she had to. She found an ally she had not looked for, which is the only kind worth having. An old woman named Marta Reyes ran a wash house 2 doors from the forge, a widow with forearms like a man's and a memory that went back to the founding of Coil Bend, and Marta had been watching the Voss woman come and go and had decided, in the private court where the old try the young, that the cook had grit. She brought Della a pot of beans on the 6th night and stayed to look at the box. And when she saw the banded iron and the false keyhole, her face changed, and she set the pot down slowly and said a thing that turned the whole story on its axis. She said she knew that box. She said it had belonged to a man named Samuel Okafor, a freighter, and a careful saver, a black man who had come up from Texas with a wagon and built an honest hauling trade in the years when the silver first came in, and that Samuel Okafor had vanished 11 years ago on the road to Helena with a strongbox full of the season's earnings, and that the town had said he ran off, and that his wife Pearl had never believed it for one day of those 11 years. Della asked where Pearl Okafor was now. Marta said she was still in Coil Bend in a sod-roofed house at the poor end of the gulch, taking in mending, an old woman now waiting for a husband the town had decided was a thief and a runaway. And Della Voss looked at the dead box in a wholly new light, because a box that men called empty was now a box that might hold a man's name and the truth of his last morning, and the work was no longer about silver at all. Here is the question I would put to you if you have ever waited on a truth the world told you to stop waiting for. How long would you keep the lamp lit? Pearl Okafor had kept hers lit 11 years. Now sit with that, and come back to the forge, where the second wheel was about to turn. The second wheel came on the 7th day, and it came hard, and it cost her. The penetrating oil had loosened the rust, but the wheel had a burr on its drive pin that caught and would not pass, and she had to file it blind, by feel, through the narrow gap of the cleaned keyway, with a needle file worn nearly smooth, and twice the file slipped and laid her knuckles open against the steel plate. And she bound them with a strip of her own petticoat and kept on, because there was no one to send for, and no time to send. Ella used to say the lock takes a little blood from everyone who opens it honestly, and that the men who used dynamite paid more in the end. She filed the burr down to nothing in the last gray light of the 7th day, and she set her tension tool, and the second wheel turned, and the box spoke its second word, and she ate cold beans in the dark, and was grateful for them. On the 8th day Tobias Crane came again, and this time he did not pretend to want scrap. He stood in the doorway with the condemnation notice in his hand, and he told her, not unkindly, that she should take what she could carry and go, that the property would be cleared on the 10th day whether the box was hers or not, that men would come with a wagon and the chest would go to the territorial yard in Helena as abandoned salvage, and that no court in the territory would side with a cook against an assessor's seal. He was giving her a chance to leave with her skin, and Della understood that, and she thanked him for it plainly. Then she asked him a question. She asked him whether he had ever opened a thing he was told was empty and found it full, and watched the faces of the men who had sworn it was empty. Crane did not answer at once. He looked at the cleaned face of the lock, at the tools she had made from scrap iron and clock spring, at the bound knuckles and the bench worn smooth by her elbows, and something moved behind his flat ledger of a face, a flicker of a man doing sums he did not like the total of. He had carried the Hills arithmetic a long time, longer than she had been in Coil Bend, and a man can carry a thing a long time and still feel the day it begins to cut his shoulder. He said only that the wagon would come on the 10th day, that he had told her plain, and that what she did with the warning was hers to decide. Then he left without the notice, and she saw that he had set it down on the bench rather than carry it back up the hill, and she wondered for the first time whether the man on the hill had men around him who were tired of the weight of what they knew. The third wheel was the worst. It had seized fully, rusted into its post so that no oil and no patience would free it, and on the 9th day Della understood that listening alone would not be enough, that she would have to do the thing Eli hated most, which was to make a hole. Not blow it, make it. She would have to drill a precise pilot hole at the exact angle Eli had taught her, a hair's breadth above the wheel post, to reach the seized wheel and free it by hand without destroying the gate that her whole plan depended on. 1 degree wrong, and she would ruin the lock forever, and the truth with it. She had no proper drill. She had a bit and brace borrowed from Marta's late husband's tools, and a steady hand, and the memory of an old man standing behind her in a Denver shop saying, "Slow, slow, the iron will tell you when." She drilled through the 9th night by lamplight, a quarter turn and a rest, a quarter turn and a rest, oiling the bit, blowing the swarf clear, her shoulders screaming and her bound knuckles aching against the cold. Twice the lamp guttered low, and she trimmed the wick with the folding knife and went on. Once, near midnight, the bit caught, and she felt it begin to wander off the line, and she stopped and set her forehead against the cold iron, and breathed until her hands were steady again, because Eli had taught her that the moment you most want to hurry is the moment the work most needs you slow. Slow, slow, the iron will tell you when. She could hear him as clear as if he stood behind her in the burned forge with his ruined hands in his pockets. Near dawn, the bit broke through into the hollow she had aimed for exactly where it should have been, a clean, small darkness opening into the seized heart of the lock, and she let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 11 years that were not even hers. She freed the 3rd wheel with a pick through the pilot hole at first light on the 10th day, the day the wagon was coming, and she set all 3 freed wheels to the only combination the box could be hiding, because Eli had taught her that a careful man sets his lock to a date or a name, and a freighter who loved his wife would not use a number he could forget. She did not know the number. Marta, though, had told her the day Samuel Okafor married Pearl, because Pearl told that story to anyone who would sit still. The 14th of June, a Tuesday, the bride in borrowed boots, and the groom in the very neckcloth that now lay folded in the dark of the box. Della set the wheels to read like a date a man carries to his grave, the way Eli had taught her a loving man marks his lock with the one number he will never let himself forget. And she felt the 4th wheel, the only one that had never seized, the only one waiting, and she turned it slow with her warmed fingers, listening, listening, and the gate dropped into the fence with a sound like a key turning in the lock of the world. The lid did not fly open. Iron does not do that. It settled and gave, and when she lifted it, the hinges groaned with 11 years of stillness, and a breath of air came out of the box that was colder than the morning, and older, the trapped air of a sealed thing, dust and oiled iron and something faintly of cedar, and the light came down through the half-burned roof and fell into the dead box. And Della Voss looked at what 11 years had kept. There was money. Canvas sacks of coin gone green at the seams, the season's haul of an honest freighter, more than she had ever seen in one place, and the weight of them was the weight she had felt under her palm in the freight yard, the low, settled heaviness of a box that was never empty at all. The money was not what made her go still. On top of the sacks, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, lay a leather wallet of papers and a freighter's route ledger bound in cedar boards, and beneath them, folded with a care that told its own story, a man's good Sunday neckcloth and a tintype of a young woman with steady eyes. And on the inside of the lid, scratched into the iron with a nail in a failing hand, where Marta said it would be, and where no living man had thought to look, a few words and a name, Samuel Okafor. The date? And the words, "They took the wagon and the team. I hid the box." Tell Pearl she read them 3 times in the falling light. She traced the letters with one finger, the deep, careful gouges of a man who had taken the time, in whatever hour was left to him, to make the marks legible, to make them last, to make sure that the iron would say what his own voice could not. A man does not scratch a message into the inside of a lid. He expects to open again himself. He scratches it for a stranger, for a someday, for a hand he will never meet. Eli used to say that every locked thing is a letter from the man who locked it to the one who opens it. Della had opened many. She had never before held one that was addressed in so many words to whoever finally came. He had not run. He had been waylaid on the Helena road, and in whatever hour he had left, he had hidden his strongbox where his attackers could not find it, and he had marked it with his own hand so that whoever opened it would know. And then he had been lost, and the men who took his wagon and his team had let the town believe the easy lie, that the black freighter had absconded, because a town that wants to think the worst of a man requires very little help to do it. And one of the names in the route ledger recurring on the freight contract Samuel Okafor had been cheated on year after year, the merchant who underpaid him, and the assessor who looked away, and the rising man who bought the silver freight monopoly out from under an honest hauler by means that lived in those cedar-bound pages, was Reuben Holloway. Della sat back on her heels in the cold light with the truth in her lap. And she did not whoop and she did not run for the sheriff. Eli had taught her that the worst thing you can do with a key is wave it around before the door is open. She closed the lid. She took only 3 things from the box: the wallet of papers, the cedar ledger, and the tintype. And she wrapped them in oilcloth and put them in her satchel, and pushed the freed wheels back to nonsense, and she was sitting on the closed box, mending the torn pocket of her wool coat, calm as Sunday. When the wagon and 4 men and the assessor's clerk arrived at mid-morning to clear the condemned property, the clerk read his notice. Della listened to all of it. Then she handed him Asa Pruitt's receipt. $4, the dead box sold and signed 11 days before any notice was nailed, and she said that a man cannot condemn and salvage a private chattel that was lawfully bought and paid for before his seal was ever wet, and that the assessor was welcome to take the burned forge and a stone, but the box was hers, and the law she was quoting was the assessor's own, and she would thank them to load her property onto Mr. Pruitt's flatbed which she had already hired. The clerk did not know what to do. The 4 men looked at the box, and at the woman, and at each other. And Tobias Crane, who had come down with them and said nothing, stepped forward and told the clerk that the woman was right, that he had seen the receipt himself, and that Mr. Porrid Holloway would not want the town saying he had stolen an iron box off a cook. The clerk, who feared a scandal more than he feared Della, let her keep the box. The wagon left empty. And Crane, before he climbed up, looked at the satchel at her hip a moment too long, and Della understood that he knew, or guessed, and had chosen, and that a man's choosing is sometimes the quietest sound in any story. She did not go to the sheriff who banked with Holloway. She did not go to the newspaper which Holloway half owned. She went that evening down to the poor end of the gulch where the houses leaned into the hillside and the smoke from the chimneys hung low in the cold, to the sod-roofed house where an old woman sat mending by a single candle, and she knocked, and waited, and heard the slow steps of someone who had long ago stopped expecting good news after dark. When Pearl Okafor opened the door, Della Voss did not make a speech. She had thought, walking down, of all the ways to say it, and had discarded every one of them because Eli had taught her that the plainest thing is the kindest when the news is large. She took the tintype from her satchel and held it out in the candlelight, the young woman with the steady eyes, and she said, "Your husband hid his box before they took him. He marked it with your name. He did not run." And she watched 11 years lift off an old woman's shoulders in the space of a single breath. Pearl Okafor took the little picture of her young self in both hands and pressed it to her mouth and made no sound at all. The candle guttered. Outside, the wind came down the gulch, and that silence in the small sod house was louder than any courtroom in the territory, because it was the silence of a woman who had been right for 11 years against a whole town that had told her she was a fool to wait, and had just been told, at last, by a stranger at her door, that the waiting had not been foolish. The papers did the rest, and they did it without a single shot and without Della Voss ever once raising her voice. The Cedar Ledger held Samuel Okafor's own careful accounting of every freight contract Holloway had taken from him by fraud, the underweighed loads, the forged tallies, the bribed assessments. 11 years of an honest man's arithmetic that proved a rising man's fortune had been built on a foundation of stolen hauling and a convenient lie about a vanished freighter. Pearl Okafor had a nephew in Helena who clerked for a territorial judge with no debt to Coyle Bend's Hill, and the wallet of papers went to him by the next coach, and the truth, once it left the gulch, moved the way truth moves when it is finally let out of an iron box, slowly and then all at once. Reuben Holloway was not arrested in a dramatic scene because the law in the territory moved on paper, and not on passion, and a man like Holloway does not get dragged into the street. What happened to him was quieter and more complete. The territorial court impounded his freight accounts. The spring assessors, when they came with questions instead of deference. His credit at the bank, which had been built on the appearance of a fortune honestly made, withered when the appearance failed, and one by one the men who had banked on him found other tables to sit at. He spent a great deal of money on lawyers, and the money did not buy back the Cedar Ledger or unscratch the name from the inside of the lid. Within a year he had sold the house on the hill and gone east, where no one had heard of Samuel Okafor and Coyle Bend, which had done what the hill told it to do for so long, discovered that the hill had been empty all along, the way the box was supposed to have been. Della Voss did not grow rich. The coin in the box was Samuel Okafor's, and it went to Pearl, every green-seamed sack of it restored to the widow after 11 years, as the law allowed, once the truth was plain, and Della carried each sack down to the sod house herself and set them on the table and would not take a coin for the carrying. Pearl pressed money on her, and Della would not have it. She had not opened the box for the silver. She had opened it because a thing the town called empty had felt, under her hand, like it had someone home. And she had been right, and being right about that was a wealth of a different kind that no assessor could impound. What she took instead, Pearl insisted on, was the box itself, the dead box. Cleaned now, the rust worked out of its bands, the lock she had freed, working sweet and true, it sat in the corner of the small shop Della took over from Marta Reyes when the old woman's hands finally gave out, a locksmith's shop, the only one in Coyle Bend, where a woman who had been cast out with $6.40 mended locks and cut keys and now and then opened a thing some other person had been told was hopeless. She kept Eli Garrett's whetstone on the bench where her hand fell to it without looking. She kept the folding knife in her pocket. And she kept Samuel Okafor's name, which she had quietly had a stonecutter carve, true at last, on a marker in the Coyle Bend burying ground, beside a space Pearl had kept empty for 11 years and would one day fill beside him. The men who had laughed in the freight yard did not, most of them, ever apologize, because men of that kind rarely find the words. Asa Pruitt was the exception. He came to her shop one cold morning about a year on, and stood turning his hat in his rope-burned hands and looked a long while at the dead box sitting clean in the corner before he could bring himself to speak. He said that he reckoned he had sold her the most expensive seat in Coyle Bend after all, and that he had been wrong about which one of them got the bargain. Della Voss, who did not gloat, told him the $4 had been fair and that she would sharpen his teamster's knives free for as long as he hauled. That was the nearest thing to an apology the town ever managed, and the nearest thing to a victory she ever wanted. On winter evenings she would sometimes lay her hand flat on the cold iron lid of the box in the corner, the way she had that first morning in the freight yard, and feel the long quiet of it, no longer a dead thing now, but an honest one, emptied of its secret and full of its meaning. And she would think of Eli's hands warming a lock, and of Samuel Okafor scratching his wife's name into the dark with the last steadiness he had, and of how a thing the world throws away can hold the one truth that brings the world to account. The box had been called empty for 11 years. It had never been empty. It had only been waiting for the right hand, and the right hand had come down the hill one cold morning, with everything it owned tied in a gray blanket, and it had known, the moment it touched the iron, that someone was home. What is the thing in your own life that everyone told you was empty, that you knew, under your hand, was not? Sit with that tonight. And if this story stayed with you, there is another. I would tell you about a woman and a sealed stagecoach in a canyon that no one had reached in 30 years, and what the desert had kept for her there. Coil Bend never put up a marker for the cook who opened the dead box. The lamp in the locksmith's shop burned late most nights, though, and the keys she cut hung in bright rows along the wall, and the old iron chest sat in its corner with its lid closed and its lock working sweet, and that was marker enough for a woman who had only ever wanted to be right about what was home.